Hey, we already have 2 people joining us on the live stream. Oh, we already have 2 people joining us on the live stream. Oh, get rid of that too. Oh, we already have 2 people joining us on the live stream. Get rid of that too. I muted the mic. You shouldn't hear the background noise so badly now. Is a slow projector today. Oh, maybe it would help if this was on. There we go. All right, so it's about time to start. I have graded many of the exams, but not all of them. So I'm going to withhold a full discussion of it until at least Thursday when I have them all graded. I'm going as fast as I can. I think I've gone pretty quickly. I think there's probably about 30 or 40 left for me to grade out of more than 100. So I'm going as quick as I can. Just give me a little more time. Having said that, some of you may have seen your grades. Some of you may be very happy with your grade. Some of you may be very unhappy with your grade. All right. next week on Tuesday, I plan on having a very minimal or zero lecture. I want that to be a day that you really reflect on your grade and schedule a meeting with me, either in person in this room or via Zoom if you're concerned about this class. All right, there might be a small lecture. I'm not 100% sure, but probably not much. All right, no more than a few minutes, or 15 or 20 minutes. All right, today we're going to talk about surplus, right? Consumer and producer surplus. Hopefully most of you have looked at chapter 5. The inquisitive was due last week. We might start taxes. I don't think so. More likely than not, I'll make a video starting discussing taxes, about 20-minute video. And I usually have that up before class. I didn't get to it today, but I will try to get it up either this afternoon or this evening. Chapter 5 SmartWorks and Chapter 7 Inquisitive are due Thursday. But this is in your favor because you know what? Next week, you won't have anything due. So I'd rather have 2 assignments again, like usual, than push one over fall break. Does that sound good with everyone else? So next week, if you're happy with your grade, you can basically take the next week off. If you're unhappy, I really want you to reflect, talk with me, think about ways to improve your grade. I really don't want anyone dropping the course, but you got to do what's best for you sometimes, okay? All right, so what is surplus? Well, we're going to make things simple. We're going to think about a world with 3 consumers. All right, we got 3 buyers, and this could be laptops, for example. Oops, that's not my pen. Make sure people can see it. So let's say we have 3 buyers. All right, and each of them is going to have something called willingness to pay. So this is a definition. I normally don't like definitions, but this is an important one. Willingness to pay, which I am going to write as the acronym often WTP. What is it? It simply means the maximum amount that a buyer will pay for a good. So most of you probably haven't bought a house, right? But when you buy a house, you really have to think about this when you're making offers on a home, because you don't really want to send your maximum willingness to pay on your first offer for sure. So you'll talk to your realtor, and maybe you're willing to pay up to $200,000 or $300,000. But of course, you want to get as much value as you can for your buck. So you want to pay for less, right? Buyers like low prices, right? This is just simply the most that you're willing to pay. So if the seller offers you an amount above this number, you would walk away. If the seller comes back, you would either try to renegotiate again or accept their offer. If they offer you more than this, you're not going to accept their offer. Maybe you'll try to renegotiate it or you'll walk away. All right, so let's think about the 3 buyers, and I have easy names. We have Alex, Bertha, and Cortez, let's say. All right, so we have 3 buyers, Alex, Bertha, and Cortez, and they're in the market for laptops, let's say. It doesn't matter what the good is, okay? I'm just giving you one that you're probably familiar with. So we're going to write down the willingness to pay for each of these individuals. Maybe Alex is willing to pay $1,000. He really needs a laptop for his class. Maybe Bertha is willing to pay $800, and Cortez is willing to pay $600. The book refers to the maximum price as the reservation price. If you see that term, the reservation price is just the maximum price someone is willing to pay. All right, but this doesn't tell us anything about how well off a consumer is. What's the other information I need to know how well off a consumer is? Like in my home example, you have their willingness to pay. What other information do you need to know how well off they are? Because that's what surplus is. It's a measure of how well off someone is. Yes. So the student said the willingness of sellers to sell. You are right. And we need that information to form what, though? So you are right. We'll eventually need that. We're just going to focus on buyers for now. So I think you were thinking of my bilateral situation where the buyer meets the seller. So imagine we have a market instead. No, you're overthinking, way overthinking. So the student said income status, way overthinking. So when we look at supply and demand, what are we interested in? There's two things we're interested in. The buyer's willing and able, but the price, right? You don't know how well off the buyer is if you don't know how much they paid for it. You say, oh, you got the laptop. I paid $10,000 for it. That person is not well off, right? So we have to know the price, all right? So let's suppose there's a competitive market, and you don't have to write that, but the market price, equals 700. All right, we want to know how well are these consumers off. We're going to call it the individual, ICS stands for individual consumer surplus. How well is each individual consumer better off when purchasing the good? Make it a little bigger because I'm going to write out the formula. This is the hard part of the course. You have to use arithmetic. Are you ready for it? So what is the individual surplus of Alex? If he buys the good at 700, but he's willing to pay 1,000, he's better off $300, right? So it's just 1,000 minus 700. Make sure people can see the work. Yep. This is equal to 300. Everyone see where I'm getting this? In other words, it's equal to the willingness to pay minus the price almost, which I'll get to in a minute. How about Bertha? How's Bertha doing? She buys that same laptop. Is she better off? Yeah. She might not be as well off as Alex, but who cares? She's happy. She's better off by $100. Everyone with me? What about Cortez? What's his surplus? Oh, hold on, I have a question from the... Yeah, so I haven't graded everyone's exam, just to be clear. I've graded about 60 to 70% of them. So they should be all done, certainly by the end of the week. I'm hoping to finish them on Thursday. Good question. I just answered an email question. All right, Cortez, what is his consumer surplus? Good, I like that answer. What's the number for doesn't have one? Don't like that answer. I like that answer. Remember, early, this is from the very first week of class. What did we say? What type of transactions are we looking at? Begins with a V. Voluntary. Voluntary transactions. All right? We're looking at voluntary transactions. If Cortez bought the computer at $700 when he only values it at $600, he would be worse off. He would not voluntarily make that purchase. Someone would have to force him to make that purchase. All right, so the formula for individual surplus is the willingness to pay minus the price if it's bigger than 0. Otherwise, it's 0. Okay? Yes. Individual consumer surplus. Individual consumer surplus. All right, so we have all this. You might say, well, why do we care? Well, first off, we want to know how much better off certain policies are. All right, and we're going to get to this later in the course. What makes a policy good? And one measure we're going to use is surplus. Surplus is not perfect. In fact, I'm going to critique it at the end of class or in the video I make later. But it's useful because it's one way to say, is this policy good or bad? All right, so what's the total consumer surplus? The total consumer surplus, in this case, is equal to, let me make sure people can see it, 300, so that's Alex's, plus 100 plus, whoops, I wrote double zero, but that's still zero. So in this case, the total surplus is 400. Because the laptops are for sale in this market with 3 consumers, the overall benefit to these consumers is $400. Now, this is the part where it gets weird. We're going to have the weirdest supply and demand graphs. It's actually just a demand graph that you'll ever see. Oops, it's from last week. I'm going to keep this. All right. And I'm going to do it to show you how we're going to get consumer surplus in a general graph. All right, so we have 3 consumers. So there's either going to be 0 buyers, 1 buyer, 2 buyers, or 3 buyers. So I'm drawing those 3 consumers demand curve we just had. There's only 3 consumers. Normally when we think about a market, we think of lots of consumers. I'm doing it just for simplicity. If the price is above 1,000, how many consumers are going to purchase the good? 0, right? None of them are going to buy it because they're all worse off in that case. So the quantity demanded is going to be 0. So I'm going to draw this squiggly line here. This is the demand curve. It looks kind of weird now, but we're just starting. At exactly 1,000, that one consumer is indifferent. So this is kind of weird. So we're going to have a horizontal line here. If the price is between 800 and 1,000, how many consumers are going to purchase the laptop? It was bigger than 800, but less than 1,000. 1. That's right, just 1. So we're going to have this weird looking demand curve like this. If the price is between 600 and 800, how many consumers? By the way, at exactly 800, we have that weird indifference. We're 2. And it's 600, between 600 and 800, exactly 2 people are going to buy it, everyone but Cortez. At exactly 600, Cortez is indifferent, so I draw that horizontal line. And below 600, all 3 consumers are willing to buy it. So this is a demand curve. A strange-looking demand curve, but it is a demand curve. Is it always downward sloping? Does it ever go up? Let me just does it ever go up? Does this curve ever go up? No, it always goes down. Okay, I know it's flat at some points, but it never goes up. So it is a demand curve. It's a weird demand curve, but it is a demand curve. And the reason I show it is because now I'm going to show you the price. So our price was 700, which was right here, between 6 and 8. I'm going to call this box B, and this box A. What is the area of box A? Any mathematicians here? Who remembers the formula for, go ahead? 300, right? It's pretty easy to do, right? Because the width is what? 1. So the only thing that matters is the height, which is 1,000 minus 700, which equals 300. And I can write that just so people know what's going on. It's 1,000 minus 700 times 1, because this width right here is 1. This, of course, is 300 times 1 is 300, and technically we should put dollars if you want, but it's $300. Or just 300, whatever. I think someone just had an epiphany. Don't worry, I'll explain in just a minute. What is the area of box B? Not 200. 2 minus 1, so the width is still 1, not 2. Yep, that's 100. I know what you did, and that's I would make the same mistake, so don't worry. So it's going to be 800 minus 700 times, and just so we avoid that mistake, 2 minus 1, which is 100. Huh. Do these numbers look familiar? What are they? Good. Right, the individual surpluses of Alex and Bertha. So this is, let me make sure people can see it on here. This is Alex's surplus. And now you probably see why I came up with names that began with A and B. And this is Bertha's surplus. And we can't draw, I guess you could extend this line out and you could draw a negative box, but they're not going to buy it. So we don't do that, right? They're not going to buy it. So what does this tell us? If we want to extend this to a general demand curve with millions of consumers perhaps, or even more, all right, we can think of each dot on that demand curve as an individual consumer. This the other way. So I'm going to draw just a standard demand curve, nothing special here. I'll use my black marker pen. So we're just drawing a demand curve. Don't forget, demand slopes down. All right, so we have demand going down. Now, let's say this is the market price. I'll call it M for market price, or PMCT, so you don't think it's the monopoly price, which won't be an issue now, but later it will be. Where's the surplus? We can't see the consumers like we did before. Remember before we could see the consumers? Well, you could think of this line as millions and millions of it. It's a tiny, tiny staircase. If you zoomed in and zoomed in and zoomed in, it would just look like the other graph I drew, a tiny, tiny staircase. Very tiny. In fact, I drew it so quickly you didn't notice I did it, but it's a very tiny staircase with a million stairs. All right, if anyone has a magnifying glass, you're more than welcome to look. Being sarcastic, obviously, but you get the point. Each of these points you can think of as a consumer. So we can think of this as the consumer willing to pay the most right here. And this is another consumer, and this is a consumer. So this is the consumer's willingness to pay, in other words, their reservation price. And how well off they are is the difference between their reservation price and the market price. So this vertical line represents the consumer surplus. And if we zoomed in, it would actually be a triangle. It's not, excuse me, a rectangle. Just like before, we had rectangles, remember? This is a consumer. This is this consumer's surplus. This is this consumer's surplus. Is this consumer right here going to purchase a good? Yeah, they don't have as much surplus, but they're still going to purchase the good because their willingness to pay is greater than the price. In fact, even over here, in this tiny one right here, etc. So this area is the consumer surplus. So in our general graph, Consumer surplus, and when I say consumer surplus, I mean total consumer surplus. It's just that we're going to use this one so much more. I'm lazy. I don't want to write TCS. That's going to be confusing. Consumer surplus is equal to the area between the demand curve and the price. Everyone understand that? Okay, so earlier we had someone mention willingness to sell. So what do you think the next thing we're going to talk about is? We'll go through it quicker because it's going to be easier. Talking about consumers. Not a trick. We're the seller, right? We're going to call them producers, but the seller. We're talking about producer surplus. All right, so now we're going to have another definition. So we're going to have three sellers again, or three again. We're going to have another definition, but instead of willingness to pay, it's willingness to sell. And I'll often use the acronym WTS, willingness to sell. This is the minimum, not the maximum, but the minimum amount a seller will accept for a good. So seller, what kind of prices do they like? Do they like high prices or low prices? A lot of you in the business school, so you need to know this. Yes, high. Good, high prices. And so when we're talking about a seller, instead of thinking of a maximum, what kind of seller would want a maximum price, right? You're always happy to take more. But there's a minimum price that you're willing to accept. If you're selling your house, you might say, don't sell my house for less than $275,000. Don't sell my house for less than $175,000, whatever. I'm happy to take $1 million for it. You might think the person who's buying it from you is making a mistake, but you might be happy to take it. All right, we're going to name our buyers, or sellers, excuse me, Javier, and I don't know, Yasmin, and Zelda, the princess. No, just Zelda, I guess. The witch, depending on what show you prefer. And let's say that these are individuals looking for a job, all right? Because when I taught you supply, remember labor markets are easiest for students to understand. So they could be whatever job. It could be a contracting job where they program stuff for someone on a computer. It could be any job. It doesn't matter. All right. So they're willing to sell their labor, and you could think of these as per hour if you want. I'm not going to write that, but you can. So maybe Javier is willing to do work for 20. Yasmin is willing to do it for 25. And Zelda is willing to do it for 30. All right. So suppose the wage or the market price, the market wage, equals $28. And remember, going back to labor markets, we can think of these as opportunity costs, right? Xavier already has a job that pays $20 an hour. Why would he leave for something else, right? Yasmin already has a job that pays $25 an hour. Zelda has a job that pays $30 an hour, etc. Now we're going to look at IPS, individual producer surplus. Right now the order is going to be switched. Remember, sellers like high prices. So if this new market, if this is something that maybe is a new industry, how much does it benefit these people? It benefits Xavier, because Xavier was willing to sell his labor for $20, but now he can do it for $28. Is he happy? He gets $8 more than he was willing to work for. So his individual surplus is 8 per hour or whatever. What about Yasmin? Yep, she's going to work. She gets 28 minus 25. So hers is equal to 3. Finally, Zelda, what's her surplus? 0. Right? She's just not going to work in that industry. She has a job that pays $30 an hour. Why is she going to work in that industry? Someone would have to force her to do it. And so the individual producer surplus is the price, in this case it's the wage, but the wage is a price, minus the willingness to sell if it's bigger than 0. If it's less than 0, then it's just 0. So our total surplus in this case, our total producer surplus, which from here on out we'll just refer to as surplus, producer surplus, is equal to the surplus of Xavier, which is 8, plus the surplus of Yasmin, which is 3, plus the surplus of Zelda, which is 0. So it equals $11. All right. The back of this one. We're going to draw a graph again. I'm going to put W for wage, but the same is going to be true if you put P for price. Wrong pen. People can see it who are watching. So now we have 3 sellers, so our Q is just going to be between 0 and 3. So it's either going to be 0, 1, 2, or 3. Suppose the price or the wage is below 20. How many people are going to work if the wage is below 20 in this industry? How many of those individuals are going to work? If it's $18, $16, 0. None of them are going to work, right? At exactly 20, 1 will work. I'm gonna make this a broken graph. I'm not going to make the distance between 20 and 25 the same. So imagine this is way down, just because I want you to be able to see the boxes when I draw them in a few minutes. All right, so between 20 and 25, exactly 1 person is willing to do it. At 25, there's 1 person that's indifferent. And then between 25 and 30, there's 2 people willing to do it. And then at 30, there's exactly 3. And then anything above 30, everyone is willing to do it. So any wage, 30 and above, you get the whole market. So this is a supply curve. Notice it always goes up, right? Does everyone see this curve always goes up? It's a weird one, but it is a supply curve. See, just to be consistent, I'm going to draw my boxes. So our wage was 28, which would be about here. I'm going to call this box X and this box Y. And you can see where I'm getting, hopefully. The area of box X is equal to, well, it's going to be 28 minus 20 times 1, which equals 8. And of course, this was Xavier's surplus. Xavier's individual producer surplus. And the area of box Y is going to be 28 minus 25. And then we have 2 minus 1. And so this is 3. This was Yasmin's individual producer surplus. And of course, we're not including Zelda because she is not in the market. She doesn't want to work in this market because she already has a job that pays her $30 an hour. So in this case, the producer surplus, again, often I'm going to write this as PS, is equal to 8 plus 3 plus 0, which is 11. You can probably guess where I'm going to go next. I'm going to draw a general supply curve. You can put W if you want to think of a labor market, but I'm being more general here. Again, I did it so fast, I drew a million stairs. Let's say this is our market price. You can think of each point on this supply curve as the minimum a seller is willing to accept. So this seller, I mean, this is someone at a garage sale, right? They just want to get rid of it as fast as they can. Right? So these people are really happy when they sell it at the market price because to them it was basically trash. Now, actually, I want to take a step back here. There's two ways to interpret this. One is if you're reselling a unit, it's how much you value the unit yourself. Like in your house, if you're selling your house, it's how much you value your house. Or it could be the cost of production. If someone offers to buy you something, this is how much it costs you to make that good in terms of both time and materials. It's either one of those. So we can do the same sort of exercise that we did with the demand curve. This is our producer surplus, or PS. All right, so here's a good question. What price maximizes surplus? Everyone have this down? I see a couple people still writing. Can I take this off? Are you still writing? Just a minute? Okay. What price maximizes total surplus? If you had to guess. And I'm not looking for a number. And I'm not talking about those two examples. I'm talking about in general. Well, this shouldn't be too surprising. Yep, the market equilibrium price is going to be the one that maximizes surplus, and I'm going to show that in just a minute. In fact, the other prices not only are going to be less, they're going to be less than what they appear to be, which I'll explain as well. All right, everyone good? So it turns out the market equilibrium price maximizes total surplus. You might say, well, professor, you didn't tell us what total surplus is. You could probably guess total surplus is equal to producer surplus plus consumer surplus. So why is that? Well, let's say that we have a price below the market equilibrium price. And suppose the government mandates it. It's like a little review. A price ceiling, in other words. So suppose this is the price. All right, so we'll call it PC because let's say it's a price ceiling. For whatever reason, this is the price. Let's say the government mandated it. We've already talked about all the negative consequences associated with it, but we never showed its effect on surplus. For producers, the surplus is actually quite clear. I'll use it's this area right here. For consumers, it's not clear. I'll explain why in a moment. But we can draw the best case scenario for consumers. The best case scenario is that those who really want it get it. I'm going to put a little star here because that is only in the best case scenario, because it's probably going to be lower than what we show. You know, when you see a little star next to something, it means, well, you got to look into it and think about it. So even under the best case scenario, we have a chunk of surplus missing. Does everyone see that? And I'll explain why it's the best case scenario. So if we have a price ceiling, we're going to have, this is a new concept, something called dead weight loss. DWL stands for dead weight loss. We're going to think of policies that create dead weight loss as bad in economics. So why is this bad? Because if the price were higher, we could have, there's a lot of people who are willing to sell the good at the higher price and people willing to buy the good at that higher price who are not able to do that. Why is this a best case scenario? Well, when the price is this low, does everyone see that this consumer still wants to purchase the product? So it could be the case that people who really don't want it buy it over here, in which case surplus is even lower, right? Because here I'm getting the people who value it most. So this is just the best case scenario. In fact, in reality, it's going to be worse. But even in the best case scenario, price ceiling is going to be much worse than the market equilibrium price. There's going to be some dead weight loss even in the best case scenario. Similarly, we do the same thing with the price above, a price floor, so we'll call it PF. So this right here is going to be the consumer surplus. And again, we're going to have the best case scenario. So I'm going to put a star here. PS star. Star means that this is just the best case scenario. It's probably going to be worse than this. Why is that? I'm assuming the most efficient sellers sell the good. At this price, there's sellers over here who will sell the good, who are not efficient at all. In fact, they wouldn't even sell at the market price, the market equilibrium price. Yes?
So when you said best case scenario, is that for the producer, and on the other graph was the best case scenario for the consumer, or is it the price above the lower market?
The best case scenario in terms of total surplus. This is the most total surplus. So if I chose any other set of points, total surplus is going to be less. That's what I mean by that. So some producers are better off and some are worse off. So I don't want to put it that way. But it turns out producer surplus is going to be less overall if there's any other allocation. So consumer surplus, this isn't a problem, right? Only those who value above the price get it. But for producers, because it's above this equilibrium, there's a bunch of them who are willing to sell it, like this guy, right? Even though in equilibrium he wouldn't. In this case, he will, since the price floor is so high. And it could be the case that that person sells it, in which case the surplus is much less than any of these lines. Does that clarify your question? Okay. All right, so this is the best case scenario. So again, we have this little corner here of dead weight loss. All right. So if we draw the market equilibrium price, I'll use the back of this. We don't have this best case scenario issue because everyone who wants to buy the product sells it. Everyone who wants to buy the product is able to purchase it. Everyone who wants to sell the product is able to sell it. So with the market price, this is our consumer surplus. And this is our producer surplus. So do you see any dead weight loss? No, there is no dead weight loss. All right, so this is sort of, even though we didn't talk about this when I talked about price controls, this is one sort of argument against price controls. We talked about all the unintended consequences, but we didn't actually have a way to measure how bad it actually was. Here's a way to actually measure how bad, even in the best case scenario, a price control can be. Now, there are a lot of critiques of measuring policies using this total surplus way. Let's see who's read the book already. Anyone know? If the only thing that matters is the total, imagine there's 5 people in a room, and you want to measure how well people off by how much income everyone in the room makes. So let's say there's 5 people, they each make $50,000. They're pretty well off. Not rich, not poor. So the average income in the room is $50,000, right? Bill Gates walks in the room. The average income is in the millions. Does that mean that everyone in the room is really better, like really well off? No. So you can see the total in the same way that the average does. The total is the same as the average, just divide it by n, right? Whenever the average goes up, the total goes up. Whenever the total goes up, the average goes up. The total doesn't take into account the distribution of benefits, just the aggregate amount of benefits. The book refers to this as equity versus efficiency. All right, and the question is, do we want policies that are more efficient or do we want ones that are more equitable? Well, there's a trade-off sometimes. Not always. Sometimes they both go in the same direction, in which case total surplus is great. When the most equitable outcome is also the most efficient, that's great. But that's not always the case. That's not always the case. And there's multiple ways to measure equity, and I'll probably save that for the lecture. There's two different ways. One is you can think about equality, for example, but there's another way, and I'll explain that in the lecture that I post this evening. All right. So that is surplus in a nutshell. I'll talk a little bit about it more tonight, and I'll also introduce taxes and how to measure government revenue in a video lecture. Does anyone have any questions before I close shop here? All right, just want to remind you next week there's going to be little to no lecture. I want you to reflect on your grade at that point. For those of you, so I know everyone thinks, oh man, he's only talking to the people who did poorly. I'm also talking about to the people who did very well, which is many of you. If you did really well, I think you should reflect on being an econ major or an econ minor. All right. I have a course that I'm teaching this winter that is really cool, behavioral economics and public policy. So I encourage you to sign up for that if you find economics interesting. And that's even less mathy than this. There's no graphs or anything, just a bunch of readings. I love graphs, but I know there's some people who don't, believe it or not. But it's a fun class, so I encourage you to take it. So anyway, that's it for today. Yes, I have a question. So just wait a second. Go ahead. So next week, only come to class if you want to talk to me individually about your grade. And you might want to email me in that case. I mean, if you're the only one here, we can talk one-on-one. But only come to class if you want to talk about your grade. And there's going to be no homework due next week. This week, of course, we do have 2 assignments due, so make sure to complete them.